history rarely turns on a single moment. More often, it is shaped by countless small decisions, quiet choices made in royal courts, whispered alliances, and unseen rivalries that slowly build over time. But sometimes, a single decision rises above all others. A choice so powerful, so far-reaching, that it reshapes the destiny of nations. This is one of those moments. A time when crowns were more than symbols. They were claims to land, power, and divine right. A time when kings ruled not just with authority, but with ambition and pride. In the early 14th century, Europe stood at a fragile crossroads. Kingdoms were strong, but stability was an illusion. Beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Political rivalries, economic competition, and questions of succession that could not easily be answered. And then, a king made a claim. Not a reckless move at first glance, but one rooted in lineage, belief, and a sense of rightful inheritance. Yet within that claim lay a dangerous miscalculation, one that underestimated the resolve of a rival kingdom. What followed was not a brief conflict, not a passing dispute between rulers, but a war that would consume generations. A war that would stretch across 116 years. A war that would see kings rise and fall, nations transform, and entire populations shaped by its violence. This is the story of how one decision, part ambition, part error, ignited a struggle between England and France that would echo through history. A war we now call the 100 Years' War. The year is 1328. France, one of the most powerful and influential kingdoms in medieval Europe, stands at the height of its authority. Its lands stretch from the Atlantic coast to the edges of the Holy Roman Empire, encompassing fertile plains, dense forests, and bustling cities. Its nobility is deeply entrenched, a complex hierarchy of dukes, counts, and barons who wield local power but swear allegiance to the crown. And its monarchy, until now, seemingly unshakable, a symbol of continuity, stability, and divine right. Yet beneath this image of strength, a dangerous problem begins to emerge, one that threatens to unravel centuries of order. The ruling dynasty is collapsing. King Charles IV, known as Charles the Fair, has died unexpectedly. He leaves behind no surviving sons, no male heirs, and no clear successor. The continuity that had defined the Capetian dynasty for over 3 centuries suddenly comes to an abrupt end. For generations, the Capetians had ruled France with remarkable regularity. From father to son, the crown passed smoothly, generation after generation, reinforcing not only political stability, but also the very legitimacy of royal authority. Kings were more than rulers. They were the living embodiment of the kingdom's identity. Their unbroken lineage was a promise that France would endure, that governance would be predictable, and that nobles and commoners alike could rely on the continuity of law, justice, and order. Now, that foundation is gone. Charles IV is the last of the direct Capetian line. With his death, certainty evaporates, replaced by doubt, a dangerous, insidious doubt. In a feudal society where loyalty is rooted in legitimacy, even a small uncertainty can become a spark that ignites rebellion, civil unrest, or foreign intervention. When a throne is uncertain, power is not simply contested, it is up for grabs. And in France, where regional lords already guard their privileges jealously, such uncertainty is a threat to the very structure of the kingdom. The question that follows is more than legal, it is existential. Who has the right to rule France? 2 primary contenders emerge, each with a claim rooted in blood, yet representing radically different futures for the kingdom. The first contender is Philip of Valois. A cousin of the late king, Philip belongs to the extended Capetian family. He is French-born, raised within the traditions and ceremonies of the royal court, and closely tied to the most powerful nobles of the kingdom. To many in France, Philip represents continuity, stability, and familiarity. He embodies the values and culture of France, and his ascension promises a monarchy that remains within the established framework of governance. The second contender is far more controversial, Edward III, King of England. Unlike Philip, Edward is not merely a noble, he is already a reigning monarch in his own right. His claim stems from his mother, Isabella of France, daughter of Philip IV. By strict bloodline reasoning, Edward's claim is arguably stronger. He is one generation closer to the Capetian lineage than Philip. In the cold arithmetic of inheritance, he might be seen as the rightful heir. Yet medieval politics rarely bow to simple logic. Edward's claim comes through his mother, a fact that French law and tradition view as deeply problematic. According to the principles later known as the Salic law, the French crown cannot pass through a female line. While its formal codification would come later, the principle was already widely acknowledged as a safeguard against foreign influence and as a means of preserving French autonomy. Accepting Edward as king would place the throne in the hands of a foreign ruler, a monarch whose interests may conflict with those of France. The very notion of a dual monarchy, with one king controlling both France and England, alarms the French nobility. For the French lords, this is not merely a legal or ceremonial matter. It is a question of survival, identity, and the defense of sovereignty. The consequences of a foreign king on French soil are immediate and severe: diminished authority for native lords, a crown beholden to distant interests, and the erosion of centuries of political and cultural tradition. The crown is more than a title. It is the heartbeat of France itself. After careful deliberation, the French nobles make their choice. Philip of Valois is crowned King Philip VI of France. The decision is swift, decisive, and strongly supported by the majority of the elite. By choosing Philip, they preserve tradition, affirm national sovereignty, and ensure that the French crown remains firmly in French hands. To the people of France, it appears that stability has been restored. The ceremonies are conducted with pomp and grandeur. The banners of Valois are raised, and for a moment the kingdom seems secure. But across the English Channel, the reaction is starkly different. To Edward III, the coronation of Philip is not merely a political maneuver. It is an affront, a denial of his rights, and an insult to his honor. At first, Edward does not react immediately. Diplomacy and patience are virtues after all, and rash action could be costly. But the seed of resentment takes root. A sense of injustice festers. A claim waits silently, biding its time, until circumstances allow it to be enforced. What seems like the resolution of a succession crisis is, in truth, only its beginning. By denying Edward III, France inadvertently sows the seeds of conflict. The question of legitimate inheritance, once a matter of protocol, now becomes a spark for a wider struggle. What started as a dynastic dispute over a crown threatens to evolve into something far more perilous: a confrontation between two powerful kingdoms, fueled by pride, blood, and the demands of honor. Thus, in 1328, France stands at a precarious crossroads. The monarchy continues, yet uncertainty lingers. A kingdom that has long projected stability and strength now faces a future that is anything but certain. One decision, Whether to accept a claim through the maternal line or to preserve tradition with Philip of Valois has set the stage for a conflict that will span decades, engulf nations, and redefine the political landscape of medieval Europe. The crisis is not simply about a crown, it is about identity, sovereignty, and the high cost of a single choice. And soon, the question of succession will explode beyond debate. Denial becomes defiance. Claim becomes conquest. And the quiet chambers of French palaces will give way to the thunder of armies and the clash of steel. The throne may have been decided in ceremony, but the battle for France is only just beginning. At first, Edward III does not rush into war. Despite the deep sting of personal and political rejection, the slight of being denied the French crown, he opts for patience, restraint, and careful calculation. Medieval politics, after all, is rarely straightforward. Open confrontation with France would be costly, uncertain, and potentially catastrophic. Armies are expensive. Logistics are complex, and the loyalties of vassals and allies are notoriously fickle. Edward knows this, and for a time, he chooses prudence over passion. So instead, he follows tradition. He performs homage to Philip VI for his lands in France, most importantly the Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast, prosperous, and strategically significant region in the southwest. This act, ceremonial and symbolic, is meant to reaffirm the status quo, to maintain peace while respecting the delicate network of feudal obligations. On paper, Edward acknowledges Philip as his feudal lord within French territory. To the outside world, it looks as though order has been maintained. Diplomacy, it seems, has prevailed. But appearances are deceptive. Beneath this fragile arrangement, tension simmers like a hidden fire. Edward is not merely a duke, he is a king. This dual status, sovereign of England yet vassal in France, creates one of the most precarious political relationships of the age. How can one king truly serve another without undermining his own authority? It is a contradiction that fosters resentment, suspicion, and eventual confrontation. For the French crown, Edward is supposed to act as a loyal subject, performing duties and respecting Philip's authority. For Edward, these obligations are humiliating, a threat to his sovereignty and to the dignity of his crown. Neither party is willing to accept the limits imposed by the other, and thus the seeds of conflict are quietly planted. The tension grows slowly, first manifesting in economic rivalry. England's economy relies heavily on the wool trade, much of it exported to the cloth-making cities of Flanders. These Flemish cities, while politically tied to France, depend on English wool for survival. This creates a tangled web of commerce, power, and allegiance where economic interests inevitably collide with political ambitions. Both England and France maneuvered to control these markets, using trade restrictions, tariffs, and political pressure to assert dominance. What begins as economic maneuvering steadily transforms into political hostility. Next come the clashes at sea. The English Channel, once a corridor of trade and travel, begins to resemble a militarized zone. Merchant ships are seized, convoys attacked, and accusations of piracy and betrayal fly across courts and councils. These skirmishes, sporadic at first, start to resemble undeclared war. Every seized ship, every confiscated cargo, increases distrust and hardens positions. The Channel, once a link between two kingdoms, is now a contested frontier. Alliances further complicate the landscape. Edward cultivates ties with France's rivals, seeking support among nobles and rulers who resent Philip VI's growing power. Simultaneously, Philip reinforces his own network of alliances, ensuring that he is not isolated should conflict arise. Every maneuver, every treaty, every promise of support tightens the geopolitical web, raising the stakes. The balance of power becomes increasingly fragile, held together by little more than diplomacy and mutual caution. And yet, war is not yet inevitable. Opportunities for compromise remain. Moments still exist where negotiation, concession, or mediation might avert open conflict. Edward could accept a limited role, keep his duchy, and continue to exert influence without provoking Philip. Theoretically, peace is still possible. Then, in 1337, Philip VI makes a decisive move. He declares that Edward has failed in his duties as a vassal, accusing him of disloyalty and defiance. In a legalistic stroke, he confiscates the Duchy of Aquitaine. For the French crown, this is a routine enforcement of feudal law. For Edward, it is a blow far beyond legality. It is an assault on his honor, his power, and his sovereignty. Aquitaine is not merely a territory. It is a source of wealth, military strength, and political influence. Its seizure weakens Edward on multiple fronts, signaling that he is no longer recognized as an equal, but as a subordinate. This is the breaking point. Edward, until now, had carefully navigated the line between ambition and restraint. But Philip's action forces a choice: accept humiliation and political diminishment, or assert his rights and challenge the system itself. Edward chooses the latter, and here lies the critical miscalculation, the decision that transforms a regional dispute into a conflict spanning generations. Edward proclaims himself the rightful king of France. This is no longer a strategic claim used for leverage or negotiation. It is a direct challenge, a declaration of ambition that undermines Philip's legitimacy and threatens the entire French monarchy. With this proclamation, the nature of the conflict transforms. It is no longer merely about Aquitaine, trade, or feudal obligations. It becomes a struggle over an entire kingdom, over honor, sovereignty, and dynastic legitimacy. Diplomacy collapses under the weight of competing claims. There is no longer room for compromise, only victory or defeat. Armies are raised, alliances solidified, and resources mobilized. What might have remained a contained rivalry between kings becomes a war that engulfs nations. Pride, ambition, and the refusal to yield drive both sides. Most crucially, once a king stakes a claim to a crown, he cannot simply retract it. Edward's declaration sets in motion forces far beyond his immediate control. The path to war is now unalterable. With one irrevocable decision, Edward III transforms a political dispute into a conflict that will last more than a century. War, once a possibility, becomes inevitable. Europe braces for the long shadow of ambition, pride, and relentless conflict. The year is 1337. What had long been a simmering conflict, fueled by rivalry, pride, and competing claims, finally erupts into open violence. Years of tension, legal wrangling, and political maneuvering have reached a breaking point. Diplomatic negotiations, once cautious and deliberate, have failed. Claims have hardened into demands, and demands have hardened into threats. The crown of France and the ambition of Edward III of England are on an irreversible collision course. And now, war begins. At first glance, the balance of power seems clear. France is the stronger kingdom. It is larger, wealthier, and far more populous than England. Its lands stretch from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Holy Roman Empire, dotted with fertile fields and bustling cities. Its noble class is vast, its military traditions deep, and its monarchy, at least in theory, unquestioned. On paper, a swift victory should be almost guaranteed. The French army, filled with armored knights, mounted lancers, and well-equipped levies, represents the pinnacle of medieval martial power. But war is not fought on paper. England, though smaller and less populous, holds advantages that are both subtle and decisive. First, it possesses a more centralized system of governance. The English crown maintains tighter control over taxation and military organization than its French counterpart. It can raise funds more efficiently, organize campaigns with greater speed, and keep armies supplied in ways that the feudal French system often cannot. This administrative edge allows England to project force beyond its shores, even into hostile territory. Second, England fields one of the most formidable weapons of the medieval world, the longbow. English longbowmen are not merely foot soldiers. They are specialists, trained from youth to draw and release their powerful bows with deadly precision. A single longbowman can fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute, each capable of piercing armor at a considerable distance. In battles to come, these soldiers will redefine combat, showing that discipline, preparation, and technology can overcome the heavy cavalry that had dominated Europe for centuries. Third, something new begins to emerge, a sense of national identity. In England, the war is not just the king's claim, it is becoming a shared cause. Nobles, townsmen, and peasants alike begin to see themselves as part of a larger struggle, united by language, culture, and common purpose. England is learning to fight as a kingdom, rather than merely as a patchwork of feudal loyalties. France, by contrast, faces internal challenges. Though powerful, it is politically fragmented. Much of its military strength lies in feudal levies, raised and commanded by nobles whose loyalty is often personal rather than national. Coordination between these forces is inconsistent. Rivalries between dukes, counts, and barons sometimes overshadow strategic considerations. Command structures are prone to confusion, and when crises arise, hesitation and disagreement can cripple response. These weaknesses will soon prove costly. In the early years of the war, England seizes the initiative. Raiding parties strike deep into French territory, attacking towns along the coast and disrupting trade routes. English forces rarely attempt immediate conquest. Instead, their strategy is to weaken and destabilize, forcing the French to respond on terms set by the English. These early campaigns sow fear, confusion, and economic strain, signaling that this war will be long, unpredictable, and devastating. Then comes one of the most decisive moments of the entire conflict. On a late summer day, English and French forces meet near the village of Crécy. The French army, larger by a significant margin, is filled with the elite of European knighthood. Mounted knights, shining in polished armor, charge with the confidence of centuries of martial tradition. They expect a swift and decisive victory, a triumph of chivalric valor over a smaller, inferior force. But the battlefield tells a different story. The English take a defensive position atop a ridge, the terrain chosen deliberately to neutralize cavalry charges. Longbowmen are strategically positioned, ready to unleash a torrent of arrows. Stakes are planted to disrupt cavalry charges, and infantrymen brace behind protective formations. As the French advance, they do so with predictable arrogance. Charge after charge is met by relentless volleys of arrows. Horses panic and stumble. Armored knights fall to the ground before they reach the English lines. Formations collapse under the hail of projectiles. The battlefield descends into chaos. The very symbol of medieval warfare, the mounted knight, is brought low not by skill or bravery, but by discipline, planning, and technology. By the end of the day, the French army is shattered. Thousands lie dead, including many of the kingdom's most powerful nobles. Crécy is more than a defeat, it is a revelation. It proves that heavy cavalry, long considered the ultimate military force, can be overcome by well-prepared infantry and innovative tactics. The battle marks the beginning of a transformation in European warfare, shifting the balance away from the dominance of mounted knights toward more strategic combined arms approaches. For England, Crécy is a triumph of planning, skill, and morale. For France, it is a humiliation whose repercussions will echo for decades. Yet the war continues, evolving with every campaign, siege, and skirmish. Riding the momentum of Crécy, English forces turn northward and lay siege to the port city of Calais. The siege is long and grueling. For nearly a year, the city resists, cut off from supplies and slowly succumbing to hunger and disease. Inside the walls, citizens endure unimaginable hardship, while outside, English forces maintain relentless pressure. Starvation, despair, and attrition take their toll. Finally, in 1347, Calais falls. Its capture is not merely tactical, it is strategic. Calais becomes a gateway, a bridgehead on French soil that allows England to move troops, provisions, and war material directly into the heart of France. For over 2 centuries, it will remain under English control, a permanent foothold that underscores the enduring nature of the conflict. The victory strengthens England's position while deepening France's crisis. Yet, just as the war seems to solidify into a pattern of conquest, a new threat emerges, one that neither sword nor strategy can combat. In 1348, the silent enemy arrives, an invisible killer that will reshape Europe as profoundly as any army. The Black Death, sweeping from Asia into the continent, will devastate populations, upend economies, and alter the course of the war. Armies will shrink, morale will falter, and cities will face horrors far beyond the battlefield. The opening chapter of this war, its first campaigns, battles, and sieges, demonstrates that medieval conflict is as much about innovation, leadership, and logistics as it is about bravery or lineage. Yet it also shows how fragile human plans are in the face of larger forces, whether political, natural, or unforeseen. And in 1337, as England and France plunge into a conflict that will last generations, the world is about to discover just how transformative and tragic war can be. In 1348, just as the war between England and France begins to intensify, an even greater catastrophe descends upon Europe. It does not arrive with banners or armies. There are no declarations, no battle lines, no trumpet calls heralding its arrival. Only ships, drifting silently into crowded ports, their crews missing or dead, their holds heavy with the unseen terror. Only rumors, whispered from distant lands, carried by merchants and travelers, tales of entire towns falling silent, of fields abandoned, of entire families succumbing overnight. And then death. The Black Death sweeps across the continent with terrifying speed, as if the world itself has been marked. Within months, it moves from the crowded coastal cities into the winding lanes of the countryside, carried along rivers, trade routes, and pilgrim paths. Markets, once bustling with merchants and farmers, become haunted places. Towns that once rang with laughter and the clatter of daily life now echo with emptiness, the silence punctuated only by the cries of the afflicted and the tolling of bells marking the dead. What begins as isolated outbreaks quickly becomes a continental disaster. No kingdom is spared, no social class is immune. Kings, nobles, priests, merchants, farmers, even wandering pilgrims, none can escape its grasp. The symptoms are swift and brutal. High fever and chills seize the body. Painful swellings erupt under the arms and in the groin. Blackened lesions mark the skin. Within days, the healthy are gone, and households vanish in a single week. Streets fall silent. The living become outnumbered by the dead. Panic spreads faster than the disease itself. In cities, corpses accumulate in homes and courtyards faster than the priests and gravediggers can manage. Mass graves are dug in hastily chosen fields, their mounds rising like dark monuments to a world gone mad. Religious processions snake through the streets, candles flickering in the fog, prayers uttered for protection, for mercy, for an explanation. Some interpret the plague as divine punishment for sins. Others blame outsiders or hidden enemies, witches, or even the stars themselves. Yet no prayer, no charm, no edict can stop the relentless march of the disease. Across Europe, millions perish. Historians estimate that nearly a third, or even half, of the population succumbs within a few short years. Entire communities vanish from the map. The human cost is incalculable, the psychological impact immeasurable. And the effects ripple far beyond the individual suffering. Armies collapse. Soldiers die in camps before they ever reach the battlefield. Garrisons are abandoned. Noble commanders struggle to maintain discipline, as fear spreads faster than orders can be delivered. The machinery of war begins to grind to a halt. Siege engines rust in empty castles. Plans for invasions are abandoned. Recruitment falters, as both kings and barons are forced to focus on survival at home rather than conquest abroad. Economies crumble. Fields lie fallow. Vineyards, orchards, and grainlands go untended. Trade slows to a crawl, and once bustling markets become empty stages for misery. Labor becomes scarce, and those who survive find themselves suddenly empowered in a society desperate for workers. Peasants and artisans can demand wages, concessions, or land, reshaping the long-standing hierarchy of feudal Europe. Villages are depopulated, homes crumble under neglect, and nature reclaims what was once tilled or paved. Roads become lonely corridors. Towns once thriving with commerce now stand as ghostly reminders of what human hands and ambition once built. For a moment, it seems as though the war itself might simply fade away, overwhelmed by a disaster far greater than any human conflict. Campaigns are delayed, battles postponed. Both England and France are forced to turn inward, struggling to survive a crisis that no strategy or diplomacy can control. But the war does not end. Instead, it mutates. Large, organized campaigns give way to fragmented skirmishes. Raids replace formal battles. Small-scale conflicts erupt unpredictably as weakened governments struggle to assert authority over their own lands. The line between war and chaos begins to blur. Desperate soldiers, unpaid and unruly, roamed the countryside. Some turn to looting. Others sell their swords to whichever side promises food and survival. Simultaneously, the social fabric of Europe is shifting under pressure. Labor scarcity transforms social relationships. Surviving workers gain leverage. Lords and landowners, once unquestioned in their authority, find themselves negotiating, paying, or losing laborers. Feudal obligations weaken, and centuries-old hierarchies begin to show cracks. Tensions rise. Peasant revolts flare in some regions, urban unrest spreads in others, and trust in traditional institutions, political, religious, and social, frays. The world is changing, and the plague accelerates the transformation. The Black Death does more than interrupt the war. It reshapes the world in which the war is fought. When the conflict eventually regains momentum, it does so in a Europe profoundly altered, a continent marked by loss, instability, and deep uncertainty. Populations are smaller, yet the ambitions, rivalries, and hatreds that fueled conflict have not diminished, they have sharpened. Old rules of warfare, governance, and social hierarchy no longer apply in the same way. Armies, kingdoms, and societies must navigate a reality forged by death on an unimaginable scale. The war that resumes in the years ahead will be harsher, less predictable, and more destructive. It will be fought by survivors who have already witnessed catastrophe, carrying with them memories of loss and a world forever changed. After facing death so intimately, after seeing the fragility of life laid bare, war no longer feels the same. Yet it continues, relentless, driven by human ambition, pride, and the stubborn persistence of old claims. In the shadow of the Black Death, Europe learns a harsh truth. Even when faced with forces beyond comprehension, human conflict endures. It evolves, it adapts, and it leaves scars that last for generations. By the mid-14th century, the long struggle between England and France had already transformed the landscape of power across Western Europe. The early campaigns, marked by shocking English victories at Crécy and throughout northern France, had shaken French confidence to its core. Yet, despite these setbacks, neither kingdom could claim supremacy. Each side remained locked in a cycle of raids, sieges, and pitched battles that increasingly demanded extraordinary strategy, resources, and human cost. The war, far from a simple contest of armies, had become a test of political endurance, economic resilience, and the very fabric of medieval society. Then, in 1356, a decisive moment arrived, a confrontation that would redefine the stakes of kingship, honor, and warfare, the Battle of Poitiers. English forces, under the command of Edward the Black Prince, the eldest son of Edward III, penetrated deep into the heart of French territory. The campaign was audacious. The English army was not the larger force. It relied on rapid maneuvering, disciplined formations, and a reliance on tactical ingenuity rather than brute force. Their longbowmen, capable of delivering volleys that could pierce armor at distance, provided a deadly advantage against the heavily armored French knights. The prince's army moved with precision, anticipating French reactions and exploiting the terrain to their favor. Opposing them was King John II of France, a monarch determined to rectify the humiliations suffered by his army in previous encounters. The French king brought to the field one of the largest armies ever assembled in his reign. He intended to use both strength of numbers and the prestige of royal authority to crush the English invaders. Yet, even the most meticulously planned strategies can unravel under the pressures of expectation, pride, and the unpredictable chaos of battle. The French forces, eager to reclaim honor and assert dominance, pushed forward with haste, and in doing so, left themselves vulnerable. When the clash began, the result was immediate and catastrophic for France. English positions, fortified and carefully selected, proved impenetrable. Longbowmen unleashed devastating salvos, breaking charges before they could reach the English lines. French cavalry faltered, infantry units became disoriented, and command coordination collapsed under the noise and confusion of battle. Amid the chaos, King John II, the sovereign of France himself, was captured, a moment so unprecedented it sent ripples of shock across Europe. A reigning king, taken prisoner in the field, symbolized not only military defeat, but a profound fracture in the divine and political order that underpinned medieval society. France plunged into crisis. With their monarch in captivity, the traditional center of authority was removed. Governance faltered, nobles began to jockey for influence, and the Dauphin, the future Charles V, struggled to assert control over a kingdom in disarray. Meanwhile, the demands of war and the costs of securing the king's release weighed heavily upon the populace. England's ransom requirements were staggering, draining the French treasury and forcing the nobility to levy new taxes on a population already weakened by famine, disease, and years of conflict. The pressure proved unbearable. By 1358, discontent erupted into the Jacquerie, a violent peasant revolt across northern France. Frustration, poverty, and resentment of the feudal elite fueled attacks on castles and estates. Lords were slaughtered, villages burned, and the social order threatened to collapse. Though the rebellion was ultimately suppressed with ruthless efficiency, its underlying message was clear. The war had exposed vulnerabilities in both governance and social cohesion, fractures that could no longer be ignored. Meanwhile, England's advantage was formidable. With King John II imprisoned, Edward III held both leverage and prestige. Negotiations dragged on, shaped by the tension between England's ambitions and France's desperate need for stability. It would take 4 years of deliberation, maneuvering, and intermittent skirmishes before a formal resolution emerged. Finally, in 1360, the Treaty of Brittany was signed. The terms heavily favored England. Edward III formally renounced his claim to the French crown, yet in return he gained extensive territories, including full sovereignty over Aquitaine, Poitou, and other regions, free from any feudal obligation to France. England acquired land, wealth, and strategic influence that would echo for decades. France regained its king, but at a tremendous cost. The kingdom's coffers were emptied, its social structure strained, and its authority questioned. For a brief moment, peace seemed possible. Armies withdrew, banners were lowered, and both nations embarked on the slow, painful process of reconstruction. Yet, beneath the surface, tension lingered. The treaty addressed territory and ransom, but it did not resolve the deeper issues of pride, ambition, and lingering claims. Loyalties remained divided, local conflicts continued, and memory of recent humiliation festered among the French nobility. The war had paused, but it was far from over. The seeds of future conflict had been sown in the fields of Poitiers, in the prisons of England, and in the hearts of the oppressed. As long as the question of succession remained unresolved, as long as ambition and resentment endured, the possibility of renewed conflict loomed. In the decades to come, the struggle between England and France would flare again, shaped by the same mix of strategy, pride, and circumstance that had so dramatically altered the fate of kings and kingdoms at Poitiers. Because in this era, wars were never truly over. They simply waited, sometimes for decades, until the next moment of reckoning arrived. And when that day came, the lessons of past victories and defeats would once again collide with the unyielding currents of human ambition, greed, and desire for glory. Over time, the nature of the conflict between England and France began to shift. The initial shock of English victories, particularly those achieved through the brilliance of longbowmen and battlefield tactics, had left France reeling. Cities burned, noble houses were devastated, and the countryside bore the scars of repeated raids. Yet, under the steady and cautious leadership of King Charles V, the French began to demonstrate an extraordinary capacity for adaptation. They learned from past defeats, observed the strengths and weaknesses of their adversaries, and gradually transformed the war into a protracted struggle on their terms. Charles V recognized that France could not match England in open field engagements. The devastating losses at battles like Crécy and Poitiers were still vivid memories, and the French army was wary of repeating such disasters. Instead of seeking immediate, decisive battles, Charles implemented a strategy that emphasized patience, preparation, and attrition. Rather than sending troops to face the well-drilled English forces directly, the French focused on fortifying towns, strengthening castles, and employing tactical retreats when necessary. By doing so, they denied the English the easy victories they had previously enjoyed, forcing them to overextend supply lines and face the harsh realities of prolonged campaigning in hostile territory. The French approach was multifaceted. Garrisons were reinforced in key cities, and local militias were trained to resist raiding parties. Logistics improved, allowing supplies to reach isolated fortresses even under siege. Charles V also leveraged the diplomatic arena, securing alliances and support from neighboring regions to isolate the English politically. By avoiding large-scale confrontation, the French inflicted constant pressure on English-held territories. Small skirmishes, ambushes, and targeted attacks gradually eroded the morale and resources of English forces. Every fortified town that resisted assault and every failed English raid served as a small victory, cumulatively undermining the English advantage. As the years passed, the effects of this strategy became evident. Territories once lost to English occupation slowly returned to French control. Cities such as Reims and Poitiers, long under threat or partial occupation, were reclaimed through careful siege tactics and strategic negotiations. Local populations, initially demoralized and fearful of the English, began to see hope in the resilient French administration. Nobles who had once supported the English, either out of fear or convenience, reconsidered their allegiances, contributing to the gradual restoration of French authority. This reclamation was not rapid, and the process required patience and meticulous planning, but its cumulative impact was undeniable. Meanwhile, England, which had initially enjoyed momentum and battlefield supremacy, began to face difficulties. Prolonged campaigns drained resources, strained the treasury, and led to growing discontent among both the nobility and common soldiers. The English king's promises of swift conquest rang increasingly hollow as the war dragged on with no decisive outcome. Disease, attrition, and desertion weakened the army, and the English presence in France, once imposing, became more tenuous. The very strengths that had enabled early victories, disciplined infantry, longbowmen, and aggressive tactics, were blunted by the French strategy of avoidance, fortified defense, and relentless small-scale pressure. Yet, despite the setbacks for England and the cautious successes of France, the conflict was far from over. Both sides remained determined, each interpreting the war through their own lens of honor, survival, and national interest. The English would continue to seek openings for decisive strikes, while the French, under Charles V, would persist in their methodical approach, combining diplomacy, attrition, and strategic patience. The war had evolved from swift, dramatic clashes to a drawn-out struggle of wits, endurance, and resource management, a war in which victory would come not to the boldest army, but to the side capable of sustaining itself through the grinding pressures of time and circumstance. By this stage, the nature of warfare itself was transforming. The lessons learned during these years would influence military thought for decades, shaping how future kings and generals approached both defense and conquest. The French, under the guidance of a cautious but capable monarch, demonstrated that a nation could recover from devastating losses, rebuild its strength, and challenge even the most formidable of invaders. And so, as the seasons passed and battles continued, both sides braced for what would become the next phase of a conflict that had already reshaped the destiny of two great nations. In the early 15th century, after decades of back-and-forth conflict, England began to regain its footing in the prolonged struggle known as the 100 Years' War. The French, though resilient, had grown weary from continuous skirmishes, shifting alliances, and internal disputes. Into this turbulent moment stepped King Henry V, a young and charismatic ruler determined to restore England's prestige and press its claims in France with decisive force. Unlike his predecessors, Henry was not content with defensive campaigns or half-measures. He envisioned a bold, aggressive strategy designed to deliver a crushing blow that could reshape the balance of power. Henry's ambitions were fueled by both political necessity and personal conviction. England, still recovering from internal instability and economic strain, needed a victory to solidify the crown and strengthen national morale. Meanwhile, the fractured state of France, riven by factional rivalries between the Armagnacs and Burgundians, presented a rare opportunity. Henry recognized that a carefully timed invasion, combined with deft diplomacy, could achieve what years of stalemate had not. In 1415, Henry launched his daring campaign. He assembled an army composed of seasoned veterans and newly trained troops, fully aware that French forces far outnumbered his own. Undeterred, he crossed the English Channel, landing at Harfleur, and quickly initiating a series of calculated moves to secure key positions. The campaign tested the endurance of his men as they marched through hostile territory, enduring disease, hunger, and constant skirmishes. Yet Henry's leadership inspired loyalty and resolve. His presence on the battlefield strengthened morale and unified his forces in a way few monarchs could achieve. The campaign's defining moment came at the Battle of Agincourt in October 1415. Outnumbered and facing a French army swelling with armored knights and well-equipped infantry, the English army appeared to be at a severe disadvantage. The battlefield, however, would prove crucial. Muddy terrain, churned by recent rain, and narrow flanking positions hampered the heavily armored French troops, making their charges deadly but cumbersome. Henry's strategic use of the longbow, a weapon mastered by English archers, turned the tide. From dawn until dusk, arrow volleys and disciplined infantry formations decimated the French nobility. Many of France's leading lords and knights perished, leaving a shockwave of devastation in the country's aristocracy. Agincourt was more than a battlefield triumph, it was a psychological victory. England, long perceived as the weaker adversary, had demonstrated not only military skill, but also the cunning leadership of its king. The victory elevated Henry V to legendary status and instilled fear and uncertainty among the French. Following Agincourt, Henry did not pause to consolidate. He pressed onward, capitalizing on the chaos and divisions within France. Through a combination of diplomacy and intimidation, he negotiated with factions of the French elite, exploiting their desperation to gain concessions that previous English kings could only dream of achieving. By 1420, Henry's relentless campaign culminated in the Treaty of Troyes, a landmark agreement that reshaped the political landscape of Western Europe. Under its terms, Henry was officially recognized as the heir to the French throne, positioning him as the future ruler of both England and France. To cement this unprecedented alliance, Henry married Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French King Charles VI, blending dynastic strategy with political pragmatism. France, for the moment, was effectively placed under English influence, and it appeared that Henry's vision of a united Anglo-French monarchy might finally be realized. For England, the treaty represented the pinnacle of achievement in the Hundred Years' War. A combination of battlefield mastery, shrewd diplomacy, and audacious ambition had produced results that had eluded generations. The English crown, seemingly poised to dominate France, basked in the triumph of strategy and heroism. Henry himself became a symbol of the warrior king archetype, immortalized in chronicles and tales for his decisiveness, courage, and intellect. Yet even as celebrations marked the success of Agincourt and the Treaty of Troyes, the fragile peace masked underlying tensions. France, though weakened, was far from defeated in spirit. Regional loyalties, nationalist sentiment, and the resilience of the French people ensured that English control would be contested at every turn. The seeds of resistance, sown by loss and humiliation, quietly began to take root. And history, as ever, had a final twist in store, one that would challenge the achievements of Henry V and remind the world that victories on paper did not guarantee lasting dominion on the ground. The rise of Henry V had demonstrated the heights a determined monarch could reach, yet it also illustrated the precariousness of power built on conquest. England had struck back with brilliance and daring, but the story of the Hundred Years' War was far from over, and the true test of Henry's legacy lay yet ahead. In the year 1429, amidst the turmoil of the Hundred Years' War, France was a land fractured by defeat, despair, and foreign occupation. The English armies, having scored successive victories on French soil, held significant portions of the north, while the French crown struggled to maintain authority and morale. The people, weary from years of bloodshed, famine, and political instability, had grown skeptical of their leaders and uncertain of the country's future. It was in this atmosphere of desperation that an extraordinary figure would emerge, one who would alter the course of the war and the destiny of a nation. Her name was Joan of Arc, a young peasant girl from the village of Domremy in northeastern France. Born around 1412, Joan lived a humble life, tending to her family's livestock and observing the rhythms of rural life. Despite her simple upbringing, she exhibited an unusual intensity of faith and a remarkable sense of purpose from an early age. According to contemporary accounts, Joan experienced visions of saints and angels who spoke to her directly, instructing her to take up the cause of France and assist the Dauphin, Charles, in reclaiming his kingdom from English control. By early 1429, Joan had made her way to the royal court at Chinon, where she sought an audience with Charles VII, the Dauphin of France. Many advisors and nobles were initially dismissive, questioning the wisdom of entrusting the fate of France to a young girl. Yet Joan's conviction, eloquence, and unwavering faith impressed the Dauphin. She predicted military successes and insisted that she could help lift the English siege of Orléans, a strategic city whose capture would open the path to Charles's coronation in Reims, a symbolically vital act for the legitimacy of his reign. Ultimately, Charles granted her command over a small contingent of troops, a decision that would soon prove pivotal. Joan of Arc's arrival at Orléans in April 1429 marked the beginning of a dramatic transformation. The city, beleaguered by months of siege and constant attacks, seemed on the brink of surrender. English forces, confident in their dominance, underestimated the impact of this young, untested figure. Yet Joan's presence invigorated the French soldiers and citizens alike. She refused to wear armor tailored to women, insisting on donning a standard suit of male military attire, and carried a simple banner emblazoned with religious symbols instead of a weapon, emphasizing her role as a spiritual as well as a military leader. Under Joan's guidance, French forces launched a series of bold assaults against the English positions surrounding Orleans. Her courage on the battlefield, often leading troops from the front despite her youth and inexperience, inspired unprecedented morale among the French fighters. Within days, the siege was lifted, a triumph that shocked the English and reverberated across France. The lifting of Orleans was not merely a tactical victory. It symbolized a turning point in the war, rekindling hope among the French and demonstrating that the tide could indeed be turned. Following this success, Joan continued to accompany the French army in a string of campaigns, aiming to secure the path for Charles VII's coronation in Reims. Her presence provided both spiritual and strategic inspiration. Soldiers rallied around her, townsmen welcomed her as a savior, and the Dauphin gained confidence as he prepared to assert his claim to the throne. In July 1429, Charles VII was crowned at Reims, fulfilling a prophecy long awaited by the French people. Joan's role in this achievement cemented her status as a national heroine, though she herself remained steadfastly focused on the mission rather than personal glory. Despite her extraordinary impact, Joan's fortunes would eventually turn. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces allied with the English and handed over to her enemies. Her subsequent trial, characterized by political intrigue and manipulation of religious law, ended with a conviction for heresy, and in 1431 she was executed by burning at the stake in Rouen. Her death was intended to extinguish the flame of French resistance, yet paradoxically, it immortalized her as a symbol of courage, faith, and national identity. Even after her martyrdom, the momentum she had created could not be halted. The French army, inspired by her example and renewed sense of unity, continued to reclaim territory from the English. Joan's legacy endured far beyond the immediate victories, shaping both the morale of the French people and the narrative of the Hundred Years' War. Over the centuries, she would come to embody the ideals of bravery, conviction, and the transformative power of individual action in the face of overwhelming adversity. In this way, Joan of Arc's brief but extraordinary life stands as one of the defining turning points of French history. Through faith, courage, and an unyielding commitment to her vision, a peasant girl from Domremy changed the course of a war, lifted the spirits of a nation, and left an indelible mark on the world, a testament to the profound impact one determined individual can have on the tides of history. The final decades of the Hundred Years' War marked a period of slow but relentless change in the balance of power between France and England. After decades of devastating conflict, punctuated by victories, defeats, and shifting allegiances, France began to assert its authority more confidently over its territory. The long years of fighting had left much of the French countryside scarred, towns and villages depopulated, and trade disrupted. Yet, amidst this destruction, a remarkable process of recovery and consolidation was underway. The French monarchy, under the guidance of successive kings and with the support of an increasingly organized administration, began to re-establish control over the regions that had long been contested. One of the most significant factors in this resurgence was the decline of English fortunes. England, which had once commanded vast swaths of French territory thanks to early military successes and strategic marriages, found its hold increasingly tenuous. Local French populations, weary of foreign occupation and inspired by renewed national identity, resisted English control whenever opportunity allowed. Towns that had been under English authority for decades gradually returned to French governance, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes by force. The morale of English forces suffered as their supply lines stretched across the Channel, and the financial strain of maintaining overseas garrisons began to erode England's capacity for sustained military campaigns. Meanwhile, the French crown took careful steps to strengthen its authority and administrative structure. Royal officials were sent to formerly rebellious regions to oversee taxation, enforce the king's law, and rebuild local governance structures. Fortifications were repaired, armies were reorganized, and a new sense of national identity began to emerge among the French people. French commanders, often inspired by the legendary actions of earlier figures like Joan of Arc, developed strategies that leveraged the strength of local militias alongside professional troops. By combining military skill with political acumen, the French gradually reclaimed key cities and strategic strongholds. By the early 1450s, the English presence in France had been reduced to a few scattered outposts. The once dominant English territories, including Normandy and Aquitaine, had returned to French control, leaving England increasingly isolated. The decisive end came in 1453, when the French launched a series of coordinated offensives that effectively eliminated the remaining English strongholds. The last significant confrontation, the Battle of Castillon, demonstrated the growing superiority of French artillery and tactics, signaling the obsolescence of traditional English methods that had once proven so devastating at battles like Agincourt. With Castillon and other final positions falling, England's ambitions on the continent were irreversibly curtailed. By the conclusion of hostilities, England retained only a single foothold, the port of Calais. Even this small possession, while strategically important for trade and military positioning, was a shadow of the vast territories once controlled by the English crown. For France, the end of the war brought more than mere territorial recovery. It marked the emergence of a stronger, more unified kingdom. The monarchy had learned the importance of centralized authority, efficient administration, and the cultivation of loyalty among the nobility. The French state, tested and strengthened by decades of war, was now better prepared to manage internal challenges and external threats alike. The social and economic impact of the war's conclusion was profound. Populations that had been displaced slowly returned to their villages and towns, fields were replanted, and trade began to flourish once more. Craftsmen, merchants, and farmers contributed to a revival of local economies, while cities such as Paris and Bordeaux became centers of renewed cultural and political life. The collective experience of enduring the war had fostered a shared sense of identity among the French people, uniting them across regional and linguistic differences. Ultimately, the 100 Years' War concluded not with a single treaty that resolved all disputes, but with the undeniable reality of French ascendancy. The English crown, weakened and introspective, turned inward to address domestic issues that would later erupt in the Wars of the Roses, while France looked forward to a period of consolidation and growth. The kingdom that emerged from the conflict was markedly different from the one that had entered it centuries earlier, more cohesive, more centralized, and imbued with a sense of resilience born of survival and triumph. The legacy of the war would echo through generations, shaping the political, social, and cultural development of France for years to come, and leaving England to reconsider the limits of its continental ambitions. In this way, 1453 stands as a watershed year in European history. It is remembered not only as the effective end of a protracted and devastating war, but also as the moment when France, battered but unbroken, stepped confidently into a future defined by unity, strength, and renewed national purpose. The long shadow of the 100 Years' War had passed, leaving in its wake a transformed landscape, both literally and metaphorically, upon which the story of France would continue to unfold. Looking back through the lens of history, it is tempting to reduce the 100 Years' War to a series of battles, heroic figures, and pivotal moments. Historians and storytellers alike often frame it around the valor of knights at Agincourt, the determination of leaders like Henry V, or the almost mythical intervention of Joan of Arc. Maps show territories won and lost. Chronicles celebrate victories and mourn defeats. Yet, when the smoke clears and the echoes of clashing swords fade, one finds that the root of the catastrophe was far more prosaic, almost deceptively simple: a dispute over succession. At the heart of the conflict was the question of legitimacy. The French throne, ancient and revered, had no clear heir when Charles IV died in 1328. Claims could be made along multiple lines, yet the most controversial came from Edward III of England, whose mother, Isabella, was the sister of the deceased king. By blood, Edward had a strong claim, but by the prevailing French laws, which favored the male line and prohibited inheritance through a female, his claim was rejected. Instead, the French nobility selected Philip VI, a cousin from a cadet branch of the Capetian dynasty. Edward III's choice at that critical juncture, whether to accept the decision of the French court or to assert his claim by force, set the stage for one of the most prolonged and devastating conflicts in European history. He chose confrontation over conciliation, pressing his rights to the throne through military might. It is difficult to overstate the magnitude of that decision. A single, personal choice by one man, a king accustomed to thinking in terms of honor, lineage, and prestige, was enough to ignite a chain of events that would last generations. What makes this decision extraordinary is not just the immediate political consequences, but the cascading effects it produced over the century that followed. Edward III's decision transformed what might have been a contained dynastic dispute into a conflict that engulfed an entire continent. Cities were burned, fields laid to waste, and entire populations displaced. The economies of both England and France suffered profoundly as the cost of sustained warfare drained treasuries and disrupted trade. Nobility and peasantry alike endured the heavy toll, while successive generations inherited the consequences of a decision made in 1328, long before they were born. The war also reshaped society in ways that its architects could scarcely have foreseen. Military tactics evolved in response to necessity. The dominance of heavily armored knights waned as English longbowmen proved devastatingly effective, and the rise of more mobile, professional armies began to redefine the nature of warfare. Fortifications were strengthened, towns and castles grew more resilient, aware that no settlement was truly safe from the ambitions of distant kings. Beyond the battlefield, the war accelerated social change. Labor shortages following repeated outbreaks of violence and famine empowered the lower classes, challenging feudal hierarchies that had persisted for centuries. Inadvertently, Edward III's personal ambition contributed to the gradual erosion of a centuries-old social order. Yet the human cost, often overlooked in chronicles obsessed with kings and generals, was profound. Entire generations grew up in a world dominated by instability, their lives shaped by sieges, raids, and the uncertainty of where the next threat might come from. Families were torn apart, villages depopulated, and cultural life disrupted. Monasteries, once centers of learning and refuge, became embroiled in the logistics of war or suffered destruction themselves. Even for those who never took up arms, the specter of war defined daily existence, casting a long shadow over normal life, from the markets to the fields to the hearths of ordinary people. And yet, historians often emphasize that Edward III likely never imagined the scale of what he unleashed. He acted within the framework of medieval kingship, bound by concepts of honor and legitimacy that were non-negotiable in his time. To him, pressing his claim may have seemed not only justified but necessary to uphold the dignity of the monarchy and secure his dynasty's place in history. Economic and social dynamics interacting over decades, amplified by the actions of those who came after him, each influenced by loyalty, vengeance, ambition, or fear. Ultimately, the story of the 100 Years' War is, at its core, a cautionary tale about the profound consequences that can arise from a single decision. One king's refusal to accept rejection transformed a legal and dynastic question into a generational tragedy. The grand narratives of battles, heroism, and victory, while compelling, are secondary to the more sobering truth. The war may have ended, leaving borders redrawn and thrones secured, but the cost of Edward III's decision lingered in the lives it touched, the societies it reshaped, and the lessons it left for generations yet to come. In reflecting on this, it becomes clear that the true cost of one decision is rarely measured only in gold, land, or titles. It is measured in human lives, in the transformation of society, in the weight of consequences inherited by those far removed from the original choice. Edward III's ambition ignited conflict, but it also illuminated a timeless reality. The most ordinary decisions of today can, under the right or wrong circumstances, echo through centuries, shaping destinies in ways no one can predict. We remember the names of kings, heroes, and martyrs. We marvel at moments of strategy and courage. But the deeper lesson lies not in the clash of armies, but in the choices that brought them to the field. The true cost of Edward III's decision was not simply measured in war or peace, in victory or defeat. It was measured in history itself, unfolding in ways that no one, not even a king, could have fully imagined.
The first light of dawn spills gently over the remnants of a land long torn by conflict. Mist rises from the trampled earth, curling around shattered banners and rusted weapons. The air is heavy with silence, a silence that carries centuries of struggle, loss, and transformation. Once this field had known the roar of armies, the clashing of steel, and the cries of men whose names history often forgot. Now it holds only memory. The 100 Years' War, as it came to be called, was not a continuous wave of battle. It was a series of storms punctuated by uneasy calms, brief truces, and unexpected resurgences. Generation after generation, men and women lived in the shadow of its cycles. Villages burned, towns changed hands, and entire landscapes were reshaped by the ambitions and fears of monarchs. Time and again, it seemed the conflict might finally end, only to flare anew, as if the very fabric of history were stubbornly unwilling to let peace prevail. Yet the war was more than a record of battles and sieges. It was a crucible in which the modern nations of Europe were forged. The flicker of national identity, once faint and fragile, began to glow more steadily amid the turmoil. Ordinary people, peasants, merchants, and soldiers found themselves swept into causes larger than their own lives. They sang, fought, and suffered not only for their lords, but increasingly for their homeland, for the idea of belonging to something greater than a patchwork of feudal obligations. At the same time, the old order of feudalism, long taken for granted, began to crumble. The loyalty of knights and vassals could no longer guarantee victory, nor could castles alone withstand the evolving tide of war. Armies grew larger, more professional, and more centralized. Kings learned to command not just through inherited bonds, but through strategy, finance, and the loyalty of a growing bureaucracy. Society itself shifted beneath the weight of conflict, moving gradually towards structures that would shape the Europe we recognize today. Warfare, too, was transformed. The longbow, the cannon, and new formations altered the calculus of battle. Bravery alone no longer determined outcomes. Planning, logistics, and innovation became decisive. The war forced rulers, commanders, and even ordinary men to reconsider the nature of combat, the value of lives, and the costs of ambition. In many ways, the 100 Years' War was a teacher, often a brutal one, whose lessons reverberated far beyond its final skirmishes. And yet, all of this, the rise of nations, the decay of old systems, the evolution of war, can trace its origin back to a single choice. One decision made in a chamber far from the front lines. One disputed claim to a crown, one king who refused compromise, who pressed his rights where perhaps prudence might have suggested restraint. Edward III of England, with his assertion of authority over the French throne, could not have imagined the centuries-long consequences of his ambition. The dynastic quarrel he pursued ignited flames that would consume generations, redraw maps, and reshape European civilization. History, in its vastness, often feels inevitable when we look back. We see the rise and fall of kingdoms, the sweep of armies, and the turning points that seem almost preordained. But the truth is simpler and more fragile. It all began with one human choice, one claim, one moment of pride and error that rippled outward with consequences no single man could contain. Now, as the sun climbs slowly above the horizon, it bathes the battlefield in light. Shadows retreat from broken walls and scorched earth. The cries of the past have faded, leaving only quiet and reflection. Grass begins to reclaim what was lost, and small wildflowers peek through the soil, resilient and persistent. Even in the aftermath of devastation, life finds a way, and in that continuity there is a lesson that the weight of a single decision can extend far beyond the moment, shaping lives, societies, and the very course of history itself. The 100 Years' War is over, yet its story endures. It whispers in the stones of castles, in the pages of chronicles, in the echoes of national identity and military strategy. It is a testament to ambition and error, to courage and suffering, and to the inexorable march of time. And in the end, it reminds us that history is not only shaped by great battles or legendary heroes, but by choices, often small in the moment, that grow into consequences vast and lasting. All of it began with one choice, one claim, one king's error, and from that single moment the course of Europe, and indeed the world, was forever changed.